Chapter 1. Early Life and Revolutionary Beginnings. Joseph Stalin was born on December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori, Georgia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. His birth name was Ioseb Vissarionis Jagashvili. He was the only surviving child of his parents, Vissarion Jagashvili, a shoemaker, and Ketevan Jaladze, a deeply religious woman. His father was an alcoholic and often violent, which made Stalin's early years difficult. His mother, however, wanted him to receive an education and sent him to a church school. As a child, Stalin suffered from several health problems, including smallpox, which left scars on his face. He also had a deformed left arm due to an accident. Despite these hardships, he performed well in school and was a strong student. His mother hoped he would become a priest, and at the age of 16, he was accepted into the Tiflis Theological Seminary. However, while studying there, he became interested in revolutionary ideas, reading books by Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers. Stalin eventually abandoned his religious studies and joined underground political groups that opposed the rule of the Russian Tsar. He became involved with the Georgian branch of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, which later split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Stalin sided with the more radical Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, and began organizing strikes and protests against the government. His revolutionary activities led to multiple arrests by the Russian authorities. Between 1902 and 1913, Stalin was arrested several times and exiled to Siberia. Each time, he managed to escape and return to revolutionary work. During this period, he adopted the name Stalin, which means man of steel in Russian. His reputation as a determined and ruthless activist grew, and he earned the trust of Lenin. By the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Stalin had positioned himself as a key member of the Bolshevik Party. He played an important role in helping the Bolsheviks take control of Russia, marking the beginning of his rise to power. Chapter 2. Rise to Power in the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Joseph Stalin became an important figure in the Bolshevik Party. The revolution led to the overthrow of the Russian monarchy and the establishment of a communist government under Vladimir Lenin. Stalin worked behind the scenes, gaining influence within the party while serving in key positions. In 1919, Stalin was appointed as the People's Commissar for Nationalities, a role that put him in charge of integrating different ethnic groups into the Soviet system. His ability to organize and maintain control over different regions helped him gain Lenin's trust. In 1922, he was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that seemed bureaucratic at first but allowed him to build a network of loyal supporters by controlling appointments and promotions within the party. During this time, Lenin began to have concerns about Stalin's growing power and ruthless nature. In his final years, Lenin wrote a letter, known as Lenin's Testament, warning that Stalin was too aggressive and should be removed from his position. However, Lenin's declining health prevented him from taking action. When Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle emerged between Stalin and other top Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky, who was one of the most well-known revolutionaries. Stalin used his position as General Secretary to outmaneuver his rivals. He formed alliances with key figures, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, to weaken Trotsky. Over the next few years, Stalin slowly eliminated his opponents through political maneuvering and accusations of disloyalty. Trotsky was forced into exile in 1929, and Stalin emerged as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. By the early 1930s, Stalin had complete control over the Communist Party and the Soviet government. He began implementing policies to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial and military superpower. His rise to power marked the beginning of a totalitarian regime where opposition was not tolerated, and political enemies were often arrested, exiled, or executed. Chapter 3. The 5-Year Plans and Industrialization. After consolidating power, Joseph Stalin introduced a series of ambitious economic programs known as the 5-Year Plans. These plans aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union and transform it from a largely agrarian society into a global industrial and military power. The first 5-year plan was launched in 1928 and focused on increasing production in key industries such as steel, coal, oil, and machinery. Massive factories and infrastructure projects were built across the country, with entire cities emerging around industrial centers. To achieve these goals, the Soviet government enforced strict control over the economy. Private businesses were abolished, and all industries were placed under state control. Workers were expected to meet high production quotas, and failure to do so was often punished severely. Propaganda campaigns encouraged citizens to work harder, portraying industrial labor as a heroic duty for the Soviet state. Agriculture was also dramatically changed through a process known as collectivization. Stalin ordered the consolidation of small farms into large, state-controlled collective farms. This policy was meant to increase food production and provide a stable food supply for the growing urban workforce. However, it faced strong resistance from many farmers, particularly the wealthier peasants known as kulaks, who refused to give up their land. The Soviet government responded with brutal force, seizing land, livestock, and grain. Many farmers were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps. The forced collectivization led to widespread famine, especially in Ukraine, where millions of people died between 1932 and 1933 in what became known as the Holodomor. Despite the human cost, Stalin's industrial policies made the Soviet Union one of the world's largest industrial powers. By the late 1930s, the country had significantly increased its production of steel, coal, and military equipment. However, this progress came at the expense of millions of lives, as forced labor, purges, and strict state control created a society ruled by fear. Stalin's 5-year plans demonstrated his commitment to making the Soviet Union an economic and military powerhouse, but they also revealed the extreme measures he was willing to take to achieve his vision. Chapter 4: The Great Purge and Political Repression. During the 1930s, Joseph Stalin launched a campaign of intense political repression known as the Great Purge. This period was marked by mass arrests, executions, and forced labor camps, as Stalin sought to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat to his power. The purge targeted not only high-ranking Communist Party members but also military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. The purge began in 1934 after the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a prominent Soviet politician. Although the exact circumstances of Kirov's death remain unclear, Stalin used the event as a pretext to justify mass purges within the Communist Party. Thousands of party members were accused of being enemies of the state, spies, or conspirators against Stalin's leadership. Many of these accusations were based on false confessions obtained through torture. High-profile trials, known as the Moscow trials, were staged to publicly convict former Bolshevik leaders, including prominent figures like Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, and Nikolai Bukharin. These trials were heavily scripted, and the accused were sentenced to execution or long years in labor camps. The purge extended beyond political figures to include the Red Army. Stalin feared that the military might pose a threat to his rule, so he ordered the arrest of top generals and officers. The purge devastated the Soviet armed forces, leading to the execution or imprisonment of tens of thousands of military personnel, including Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of the USSR's most skilled commanders. This weakened the Soviet military at a critical time, leaving it unprepared for the coming conflict with Nazi Germany. Ordinary citizens also suffered during the Great Purge. The secret police, known as the NKVD, carried out mass arrests, sending millions of people to labor camps called gulags. These camps, located in remote and harsh environments like Siberia, forced prisoners to work under brutal conditions. Many people died from starvation, exhaustion, or execution. Citizens lived in constant fear, as even minor accusations could lead to imprisonment or death. Stalin's purges created a climate of paranoia, where trust among citizens was shattered. People were encouraged to report their neighbors, co-workers, and even family members to the authorities. The purges wiped out much of the Soviet Union's intellectual and political elite, leaving a society dominated by fear and absolute obedience to Stalin. Although the repression strengthened Stalin's grip on power, it also crippled the country's institutions and military, causing long-term damage to the Soviet state. Chapter 5: World War II and Stalin's Leadership. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Joseph Stalin faced one of the greatest challenges of his rule. Initially caught off guard by Hitler's betrayal, Stalin had ignored warnings from intelligence sources that Germany was preparing for an attack. The German invasion, known as Operation Barbarossa, was devastating. The Soviet army suffered huge losses in the early months, and the Germans advanced rapidly, capturing large areas of Soviet territory, including Ukraine and Belarus. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or taken prisoner, and the situation seemed hopeless. Stalin took immediate control of the war effort, delivering a powerful speech to rally the Soviet people. He called for a great patriotic war to defend the motherland, using nationalism to unite the population. Despite his earlier purges of the military leadership, which had weakened the Red Army, he worked to reorganize and strengthen the Soviet forces. He also moved key industries eastward, away from the front lines, to ensure continued production of weapons and supplies. The brutal winter of 1941 to 1942 helped slow the German advance, giving the Soviet army time to regroup. The turning point of the war came in the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, where Soviet forces successfully defended the city and then launched a counteroffensive. The battle was one of the bloodiest in history, with massive casualties on both sides. Stalin's strategy of refusing to surrender the city at any cost led to enormous Soviet losses, but it ultimately resulted in the defeat of the German Sixth Army. This victory marked a turning point in the war, shifting momentum in favor of the Soviets. Stalin also played a key role in the larger Allied war effort. He attended major conferences with Western leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, negotiating strategies and post-war plans. At the Tehran Conference, 1943, and the Yalta Conference, 1945, he secured Soviet control over Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for the future division of Europe during the Cold War. As the Red Army pushed westward, it played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany. In 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin, capturing the city and effectively ending the war in Europe. Stalin used the victory to solidify his power, portraying himself as the savior of the Soviet Union. However, the cost of victory was immense. Tens of millions of Soviets had died, cities were destroyed, and the country was left in ruins. Despite these losses, Stalin emerged from World War II as one of the most powerful leaders in the world, with the Soviet Union established as a global superpower. Chapter 6: The Cold War and Stalin's Rule After World War II. After World War II, Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union into a new era of global conflict known as the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States, once allies against Nazi Germany, became bitter rivals. Their competing ideologies, communism and capitalism, divided the world, leading to political tensions, military buildups, and proxy wars. Stalin was determined to expand Soviet influence, and he tightened control over Eastern Europe, ensuring that communist governments remained loyal to Moscow. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, Stalin negotiated the post-war order with Western leaders. He pushed for Soviet control over Eastern Europe, claiming that it was necessary for security. As a result, countries such as Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria became Soviet satellite states. Stalin installed communist governments in these countries and suppressed any opposition. This expansion of Soviet influence created deep mistrust between the Soviet Union and the West. One of the first major conflicts of the Cold War was the Berlin blockade in 1948 to 1949. Stalin attempted to cut off Western access to West Berlin by blocking all road and rail routes. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, delivering food and supplies by air for nearly a year until Stalin lifted the blockade. This event heightened tensions and led to the official division of Germany into East and West, with East Germany falling under Soviet control. Domestically, Stalin's rule remained harsh. His post-war policies emphasized rapid reconstruction and industrial growth. The Soviet Union had suffered immense destruction during the war, and Stalin launched new five-year plans to rebuild the economy. He prioritized heavy industry, military production, and collectivized agriculture. While this helped the Soviet Union regain strength, it placed a heavy burden on workers and peasants, many of whom lived in poor conditions with limited freedoms. Repression continued under Stalin's leadership. He feared opposition and used secret police, mass surveillance, and labor camps to maintain control. Millions of people were sent to gulags, harsh forced labor camps in remote regions, where many died from exhaustion, starvation, or brutal treatment. Writers, intellectuals, and political figures who were suspected of disloyalty were arrested, executed, or exiled. Stalin's influence extended beyond the Soviet Union. He supported communist movements worldwide, including in China, where Mao Zedong's Communist Party took power in 1949. The Soviet Union also backed North Korea in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, a conflict that further intensified Cold War divisions. Stalin's aggressive foreign policy and military expansionism increased tensions with the West, leading to an arms race and the development of nuclear weapons on both sides. Despite his successes in rebuilding the Soviet Union and expanding its influence, Stalin's later years were marked by growing paranoia. He became increasingly suspicious of his advisors and even planned new purges before his death in 1953. His rule left a lasting impact on the Soviet Union, shaping the course of the Cold War and influencing global politics for decades. However, his harsh policies and brutal repression left deep scars on Soviet society, and after his death, many of his actions were condemned by his successors. Chapter 7: Stalin's Death and Its Aftermath. Joseph Stalin's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and a tightening grip on power. He continued to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest advisors. He isolated himself in his dacha outside Moscow, trusting only a small circle of officials. He ordered new purges and repressions, including the infamous doctors' plot, in which he accused a group of mainly Jewish doctors of conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. This led to a wave of arrests and growing fear among the Soviet elite. However, before the crackdown could reach full force, Stalin's life came to an unexpected end. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin spent time with his top officials, including Nikita Khrushchev, Lavrentiy Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and others. After they left, he retired to his private quarters. The next morning, when he failed to emerge, his guards hesitated to check on him, fearing his wrath if they disturbed him unnecessarily. Hours passed before they finally entered his room, where they found him lying on the floor, barely conscious. He had suffered a massive stroke. For several days, Stalin remained in a semi-conscious state, unable to speak clearly or move properly. His closest advisors and doctors gathered around, unsure of how to proceed. Some, like Beria, were eager to take control, while others waited anxiously for developments. Medical treatment was slow, and some believe that his death was deliberately allowed, or even hastened, by those who wanted to see him gone. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin was pronounced dead at the age of 74. The news of Stalin's death sent shockwaves across the Soviet Union. Millions of people mourned, as they had been conditioned to see him as a great leader. His body was embalmed and placed in the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square, alongside Vladimir Lenin. Hundreds of thousands of people attended his funeral, and in the chaos, many were crushed to death by the crowds. Behind the scenes, a power struggle quickly unfolded. Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the secret police, initially seemed poised to take control. However, other leaders, including Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov, soon turned against him. Within months, Beria was arrested, accused of crimes against the state, and executed. In the years following Stalin's death, the Soviet leadership sought to distance itself from his brutal legacy. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech, in which he condemned Stalin's purges, repression, and cult of personality. This speech shocked the Communist Party and led to a period of de-Stalinization, during which many political prisoners were released, and Stalin's policies were reversed. His statues were taken down, his name was removed from cities and buildings, and in 1961, his body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum and buried in a less prominent spot near the Kremlin. Despite efforts to erase Stalin's influence, his legacy remained deeply embedded in Soviet society. While some viewed him as a tyrant responsible for mass suffering, others saw him as a strong leader who had turned the Soviet Union into a superpower. His rule left an undeniable mark on world history, shaping the course of the Cold War and influencing global politics for decades to come. Chapter 8: Stalin's legacy and controversy. Joseph Stalin's legacy remains one of the most complex and controversial in modern history. His rule transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower, but it came at an immense human cost. Historians, politicians, and ordinary people continue to debate whether he was a necessary force for Soviet progress or a ruthless dictator whose actions caused immense suffering. One of Stalin's most significant achievements was the industrialization of the Soviet Union. Through his 5-year plans, he rapidly developed heavy industry, expanded infrastructure, and modernized agriculture, although at a great human cost. His policies turned the USSR into an industrial powerhouse capable of defeating Nazi Germany and competing with the West during the Cold War. However, forced collectivization, widespread famine, such as the Holodomor in Ukraine, and brutal purges left deep scars on Soviet society. Stalin's role in World War II solidified his reputation as a formidable leader. Under his command, the Soviet Union played a decisive role in defeating Hitler's forces. The victory in 1945 elevated Stalin to near-mythical status in Soviet propaganda, portraying him as the savior of the nation. However, his wartime leadership was also marked by disastrous miscalculations early in the war, leading to massive Soviet casualties. Additionally, his paranoia extended even to his own military officers, many of whom he had purged before the war began. The Great Purge of the 1930s remains one of the darkest aspects of Stalin's rule. Millions of people were executed, sent to labor camps, or imprisoned on fabricated charges. His secret police, the NKVD, carried out mass arrests, targeting political opponents, intellectuals, and even loyal Communist Party members. The atmosphere of fear permeated every level of Soviet life, making it dangerous to express dissent or even speak openly about government policies. Internationally, Stalin's legacy is equally divisive. In some countries, he is seen as the leader who defeated fascism and expanded socialism, while in others, he is remembered as a brutal dictator. During the Cold War, his policies helped shape the ideological divide between the East and West, influencing conflicts, revolutions, and global power struggles. After Stalin's death, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, denounced him in 1956 during the famous secret speech, exposing the extent of his crimes and initiating a process of de-Stalinization. Statues were torn down, political prisoners were released, and his cult of personality was officially condemned. However, his influence persisted, and some later Soviet leaders continued to admire aspects of his rule. Even today, Stalin remains a polarizing figure. In Russia and other former Soviet states, some view him as a strong leader who brought order and power to the USSR, while others see him as a tyrant who ruled through terror. His policies reshaped the world, and the debate over his legacy continues in academic circles, politics, and public discourse. Whether seen as a hero or a villain, Stalin's impact on history is undeniable, and his rule continues to be studied, analyzed, and debated to this day.